This is the fourth presentation in a series of short presentations I'm giving on the book of Revelation. This one I want to focus on chapters 12 through 18 of the book, and I want to try, though, at least at the beginning, to make a few remarks about the wrath of God, which is a dominant theme that we see throughout this book. I mentioned it in the third presentation, but wasn't able to develop that idea, and so I'd like to begin with that, and then I will make a few quick remarks about five features or five topics that we find in chapters 12 through 18. First of all, on the wrath of God, I would suggest that the wrath of God should not be understood as God's emotional reaction to human changing sinfulness or evil. Instead, we should see the wrath of God as the way that human beings who choose to turn away from God experience the love of God. God, in Christian theology, we believe is eternal, unchanging love. In fact, in the essence of God, God is in fact love. The eternal relationship between Father, Son, and Holy Spirit tells us that God, at the deepest level, in the most profound way, is an eternal communion of love. So the God who is love chose to make a world of creatures like ourselves, to make a universe like ours, a universe that could freely, in some sense, return to its cause. But because God, who is eternal freedom, eternal love, because the God who is eternally free and eternally love, because that God has made intelligent creatures like ourselves in the midst of this universe, in the evolving of the universe, intelligence emerged. And that intelligence is characterized by freedom, by the opportunity to return to God in love, because that is the God who made us. He is love and He is free. And so we are called to return to our cause freely and in love. However, the problem is, because we were free, the story of the Bible is that we chose poorly at some point, and we continue to do so. And so evil has entered into a world made by a perfectly good and loving God. Now, God did not abandon the world, however. He comes to the world to save it. He comes to bring salvation to a world of creatures who have turned from their cause or from their God. So God is perfect love. But if I turn away from God, I experience God's love as wrath. Imagine in your own experience, in your own life, when you, perhaps you do something that you know is profoundly offensive to someone that you deeply love. Your tendency probably is to avoid that person because you're embarrassed by what you did. You're hurt by what you did. In other words, your love for that other person and your failure to show that love, or perhaps your failure to truly love that person as you ought, results in deep shame and deep sadness. Take also other experiences where another person, let's say someone who does what is good and what is right and loves what is good and right, and let's say that you don't. You want to do what is wrong, and so you try to hide from that person. You try to get away from that person, or perhaps you even hate that person because of the good that they stand for that you don't love. In other words, if somebody loves something that you hate, you will tend to hate that person, or you will tend to turn away from that person, or to be angered by that person, or to look for the bad in that person. I would suggest to you that God is infinite love, and when we sin against the God who is infinite love, and we are not sorry about that, we turn toward God in hate. We don't want God to be looking at our lives. I think of someone like Jean-Paul Sartre, the famous French philosopher and atheist, who lamented the fact that God, the very notion of God as one who looks at us and sees us always, to him was hellish in itself. He wrote a famous play called No Exit, in which one of the famous lines from the play is that hell is other people. He describes hell as people who stand around or sit around in a room together and look at each other, knowing all of the wickedness that is present in them, and knowing all of their bad deeds, and they look at each other forever. They can't even blink. They look at one another and they see them for what they truly are. Jean-Paul Sartre thought that no one could truly see another person and truly love them, that what we try to do is cover up who we really are and put on a facade for other people to see. But if we were to see beyond the facade and see the person for what they really are, we would hate them, we would despise them. And so for Jean-Paul Sartre, the very notion of a God who sees us always and knows everything about us is tormenting to him. And so he would rather discard and postulate the non-existence of God than to live with the notion of a God who sees us exhaustively and completely. Now, I would suggest to you that the wrath of God is to be understood this way, that it's not because God looks upon some and despises them. Instead, it's that the God who is love is experienced as wrath, because there are those who, when they come in the presence of God, they are ashamed, they are hateful, they reject God. So later in the book of Revelation, for example, we'll see that the false prophet and the beast, these embodiments of evil in the book, when it describes them as being in the presence of God and of the Lamb, which to me is a very fascinating thing, that they're in the presence, they're tormented day and night forever and ever in the presence of God and of the Lamb. How is it that they're in the presence of God? And how is it they are tormented by God's presence while others are fulfilled in God's presence? I would suggest to you it's because of their disposition. It's because of their relation to God. So one person stands in the presence of God, and it is a hellish experience because they are opposed to the love of God. They're opposed to what God is all about. The other person, however, opens themselves to God, opens their heart to God, and they find themselves perfectly fulfilled in God's presence. So I would throw that out as a way of thinking about the wrath of God as we experience it and as it is described in this book. Now let me rush through 5 points here very quickly about the book. The first one that I would point out is in chapter 12, we have a very important vision that appears. We see a woman that is clothed with the sun at the beginning of the chapter, and this woman travails to give birth to a child. She has crowns upon her head. She has 12 stars over her head. She's clothed with the sun. It's a very glorious depiction at the beginning of the chapter. But this woman travails to give birth to a child. That child is born, a man-child is born, who will rule all the nations. However, there is a dragon who appears, or a serpent that appears, that pursues the man-child and seeks to destroy him. But instead, the child is protected, and he's taken up into heaven, and God protects the woman. And then the woman goes about trying to make war with the offspring of the woman, or with the people of God. We see also that Michael the archangel battles with Satan and casts him out of the heavens in the story. This is a highly symbolic story. There's lots of imagery that's used here. First of all, it calls to mind a very important text in Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, called the Proto-Evangelium. There we have the story of Adam and Eve, and God who addresses the man and the woman and the serpent in the story. And out of that comes a very famous prophecy in Genesis chapter 3 that is called the first gospel, or the Proto-Evangelium. It is the first declaration of good news to come. The good news is that the serpent is going to be defeated by a child of the woman, but that there's going to be a struggle. There's going to be an ongoing struggle between the seed of the serpent, or those who follow the way of Satan, or the evil force personified here in this snake. And then we have the child of the woman, who one day a child of the woman would ultimately crush the head of the serpent, although he would be wounded in the process. He would bruise his heel, and he will crush your head, the story says. So here in Revelation chapter 12, we see that prophecy brought to its fulfillment in its description of the woman who gives birth to the man-child, obviously Jesus here, who will rule all nations of the earth, and he will defeat the dragon, or the serpent. And we'll see more of that in chapters to come. The second thing that I would highlight is in chapter 13. We see here something very different than what we saw in chapter 12. We see a great beast that arises up from the sea, and another beast that arises up on the land. The beast that arises from the sea appears to be this perhaps the Roman Empire. Most would interpret it as the Roman Empire that is situated in Rome, that seeks dominance over all of the world. Perhaps it's some type of symbolism borrowing from Rome. It's a combination of imagery that's used here, taken from the prophet Daniel in the Old Testament. But clearly it's intended to be a sort of representation of a vast force of evil that has brought all of the world under its influence. And we'll see that again in the chapters that follow. We also have introduced here in chapter 13 the famous mark of the beast, that the beast that comes up out of the sea and the one that comes up on the land, who interestingly is described as a lamb that has the voice of a dragon. So it looks to be passive. It looks to be the kind of thing that you'd go up and pet it or be close to it and you wouldn't fear it. And so we first have the great beast that comes up out of the sea, this political power, and then we have a lamb that appears to be a softer face of this force of evil, but that all people are required to follow the beast, to follow the way of evil, and if they do not receive a mark indicating their allegiance to these forces of evil on their forehead or on their hand, then they are not allowed to buy or sell. In other words, everyone is expected to become a follower of this evil force that has stretched its tentacles into all nations and all people. What is this mark of the beast, and what is this number 666? There are various different interpretations of it. Some see the number 666 as simply a symbolic way of referring to the perpetual failure of evil to live up to the way of God, because the number 7, of course, indicates perfection, and so the repetition of the number 6 perhaps suggests that this represents a force and a system and a way of life, a way of thinking that is always coming short. It's the way of man apart from God. Another way of interpreting this would be to see it as perhaps being a symbolic way of referring to an actual person. The Hebrew language, for example, as well as the Latin language and the Greek language, uses letters to represent numbers. And so the number 666 perhaps represents a name that has that numerical value. The problem is there are lots of names that can be made to work with the number 666. One plausible suggestion is that it is the name of Caesar Nero, which, if you use the Hebrew numerical system, ends up being 666, and perhaps it's a way of referring to Emperor Nero, a great wicked emperor, Roman emperor in the 1st century, who opposed Christianity and persecuted especially some of the leaders of the early church, Peter and Paul being two of them. And so perhaps it's a way of referring to Emperor Nero. Perhaps it is something else, like the other suggestion that I gave you. One other quick point I would make about the mark of the beast on the forehead or on the right hand would be this, that the ancient Jews, and all the way up until today, many Orthodox Jews continue to use what are called phylacteries, or the tephilim, where they wrap or put around their head a box that has a scroll in it, or they wrap the same sort of thing around their hand as part of their prayer paraphernalia. And so they put this on their head or they put it on their hand as a way of reminding them that God is to be deep in their mind and deep into their work or into their allegiance or their commitment, represented by the hand and by the forehead. And so this is a way of using a physical object to interiorize or to remind oneself of the need to put God's law deep within the heart, the mind. And so maybe the reference to putting the mark of the beast, this allegiance to this force of evil on the head or on the hand, is a way of playing on this tephilim, that instead of God being deep in the mind or deep in their commitment and their relationships, instead they have adopted a way of thinking and a way of acting that is evil and that is after the way of the beast that is described here in this chapter. The third point that I would highlight is one that I've already suggested, and that is in chapter 14 and also in 17 and 18. We have this declaration of a mystery, the mystery of Babylon, Babylon the Great. Here we have this description of Babylon, this fantastic city that has turned against all that is related to God and experiences great destruction. And there's lots of discussion about what exactly is this Babylon, this mystery religion or this mystery city. What is its identity? Clearly Babylon had long ago been destroyed, and so it's symbolic of something else. The most likely candidate here is Rome, that Rome sort of was the present-day embodiment of great evil in its opposition to Christianity, especially in the context of this book. But more broadly, Babylon here represents the whole system of things that opposes God. 2 points real quick. Another possibility, by the way, is that we're talking here about Jerusalem in its sort of religious opposition to Christianity, which is another possibility. Another possibility is that really we're blending together these two ways of thinking, one religious and one political, in opposition to the Christian faith, and that was the source of great persecution in the context, most likely, of the writing of this book. In any case, the end of the story is that the world turns against Babylon, that eventually the opposition to the ways of God brings about the downfall of Babylon. And that also is related to my next point, which is found in chapter 14, that we have the ultimate triumph of the saints, or the people of God, that is described in chapter 14. there's several interesting points there, but I'm very short on time. And then I wanted to say something about Armageddon, which functions in the book as a representation of a final climactic battle between the forces of good and evil. But perhaps in the next presentation, in the final presentation, I'll say a little bit more about the triumph of the saints described in chapter 14. And even if I don't, that's a major theme in the rest of the book.